So the remote audience will tune in, and we will be already in a lively and fruitful and productive discussion, and I'll handle the flack for that. But anyway, I'm Jeff Phillips, the Executive Director for the Reserve Organization of America, 100 years old in October. We're very proud and honored to have you all here to discuss an extraordinarily important topic. And we're going to have a formal introduction in moments by Mark Elliott, but we want to welcome General John Jensen, General Jody Daniels, Rear Admiral Miriam Lafferty, Force Master Chief Tracy Hunt, great to have an NCO in the group, SES Mr. Greg Hable from the Marine Corps, John Healy from our Air Force Reserve, and of course Mark will be doing the introductions. And I'm just going to take up a couple of minutes here. We had a session earlier for our Citizen Warrior Coalition, and I want to thank the participants, everyone who was here yesterday or this morning at that great discussion. This shows how fortunate our nation is to have these supportive and engaged private sector employers backing the great young men and women in our Reserve and National Guard, our Reserve components. We look forward to working with them as we develop law and policy to facilitate the conditions for readiness and sustainability in the Reserve Force. This afternoon, we welcome the leadership of our Reserve components who are here to discuss their goals and challenges and how we can support their readiness, which, as we know, is essential to the national security of America and thus to the free world. Readiness, however, is a partnership with our employers, a two-way street, and we must understand as well how government law and policy can be reformed to facilitate employer support of the Reserve Force. So this is not just about how we can support the military, but it is also how the government, and I'm not pointing fingers at these senior officials, but how our government, how the voters can in turn support employers and to facilitate their support of the employment and retention of members of the Reserve and Guard in their workforce. ROA's sole purpose for a century has been our national security through a focus on the readiness of the Reserve and the National Guard, the Reserve components. We are the only national military organization that solely and exclusively supports the Reserve and the Guard. To that end, we look forward to this afternoon's discussion and to its natural extension during our reception later today. So thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be with you. We look forward to a very productive beginning and then the extension of our effort to a force that is ready, that is supported in a robust and continuing fashion by America's employers and by law and policy. Mark, your introductions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So despite what was said, I am not going to do long-winded introductions. If you look inside your program, there is a QR code that you can look and see the distinguished career of each of our panelists here, and I don't think they want me to embarrass them by reading their bios. But what we do want to have is a conversation, and clearly we've gotten some scripted questions that we're going to kind of walk through, but I've told them that if we go off on a tangent, it's because it's necessary to go off on that tangent. But this is about how do we make things better. We were having a little bit of a conversation in the room earlier about some of the challenges we have. And we want to explore a few of those challenges. I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'll direct them at some of the panelists. But I told them if the flow is there, we're going to flow. And so the first question I really wanted to kind of start off with, and each of our leaders here are very familiar with some of the challenges that we have in the military, in particular in the active duty component, where if you just look at the Army, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of around 25% short of their recruiting goals for last year. And I don't think that's any different for the other services. The numbers may be a little bit off for each service, but I think they would echo sentiments similar to that around the challenges the Army had. But when you think about those challenges, you really want to ask yourself, how does that impact the Guard and Reserve? Is there some degree of pressure that is being placed on the Guard and Reserve as a result of the challenges the active component is having? And so I'm going to go to General Daniels and Mr. Hable and Force Master Chief Hunt for this first series of questions. And so when you think about those challenges, that the active component is dealing with, how is that impacting your mission, your readiness, your ability to do the work of the nation? And I want to kind of continue on that with, are there some things, that issues that you're trying to address as a result of that? And probably on the backside of that, is there some partnerships with industry where industry can maybe help in that stead? So, General Daniels.
So I would say that so far, we're okay. We're doing fine. The Army Reserve has not missed a mission. We've been able to meet all of our obligations. We continue to mobilize on the order of about 10 to 12,000 soldiers every year. And so we're still meeting all those commitments and obligations. If the active component ends up drawing down in strength, then we forecast that there's going to be more missions coming over to the Army Reserve, which would then increase our operations tempo. What effect that might have remains to be seen. I think we're in a pretty good place right now in terms of how much mission we're doing. We had been up at about 15,000. We've come down to like 10 to 12. And so that seems like a pretty good place for soldiers who want to go do something exciting that's not at home versus those who want to stay home. So we're in a pretty good place right now. If that changes, we'll have to relook at the landscape. How do we work with employers? We've got Miss Alicia Grady sitting over here at table 2, which seems to be the cool kids table because everyone seems to have migrated there. And she runs our private-public partnership office. And so we actually have outreach with a lot of corporations trying to make matches for those soldiers who are currently serving in the Army Reserve who are either unemployed, underemployed, or just want to change careers, as well as their spouses, to help out with credentialing and things of that nature, as well as talking to the active duty soldiers who are departing from active service and are transitioning out into going to college, going to get employment, going to do whatever it is they're going to do, to talk about becoming a member of the Guard or the Reserve. And we can help them find a unit and find employment simultaneously. And so we're regardless of where it is they're going to land when they depart from their active component location. So the one thing that I say is I'm not in competition with business folks. I want to share talent. I want to have dual career paths. And I characterize it 2 ways. One is broadening and one is deepening. So you'll find those folks who do something in their reserve career that is identical to what they do in their civilian career. Doctors, lawyers prototypically do sort of the same thing in both activities. But then you've got other folks, so those are folks that are really deep. They're really good experts in an area. Those other folks are like, I don't want to do anything like what I'm doing at work for my reserve position. So, I've found some medical lab technicians. I'm like, well, what do you study? Well, I'm working on a degree in cybersecurity. Of course you are. So they're doing something very, very different. And so those are the folks that I consider sort of broadening. They have dual career paths, but they're getting expertise in multiple areas. So I would ask you all, what the quality of the product is that is serving in our formations, all of our formations. Thank you for sharing, and please share some more. Who else is in your formations, in your organizations that could be a member of the Reserve or the Guard? And please encourage them to become a member of our formations.
I love that. Mr. Hable, are there some things that you're seeing in your space that may contradict, some of the things, General Daniels said as far as the challenges?
No, I think we're sharing some of the same challenges. We've made our recruiting mission, but it's not necessarily all the skill sets that we need. So we're making them in large numbers, not necessarily in the exact skill set. And that's true on the active duty side as well. What's kind of unique for the Marine Corps, I'd say the biggest thing that is impacting reserve use right now is a force design. The Marine Corps is transforming our capabilities to meet the current threats of today, and they're having to take active duty units offline to transition equipment, transition capabilities, but our commitments to being forward deployed are still there. So we do things in a 5-year, we call it the FIT-UP, the 5-year defense plan. And this current FIT-UP saw about a 40% increase across the fit-up in the reserve forces. So given where we were with some of our challenges with unique skills, it's taking sometimes 2 or 3 of our units to make one, and they're in more demand right now. So I think my obligation to you all is to try to give you as much notice. The good thing about a fit-up is it's planned out, right? So I can come and say, look, I'm going to need these 3 units 2 years from now, and give you enough advance notice so that you can work your schedules and still support what we're trying to do. Occasionally, there's times where we don't have that luxury. We needed a very quick HIMARS capability with very short notice, and we were able to do that. But I had to reach out to a lot of employers with letters trying to explain, sorry, this isn't the way we normally want to do business, but this is kind of an in extremis situation with what's going around the world right now, and so sometimes we have to do that. But we want to give you as much advance notice. I could not agree with General Daniels more, though, on the partnering with you. So the retention has been a problem on the active side, and what we've been saying is, hey, from an active perspective, they try to keep somebody, they try to get them to re-enlist, stay in, and they just view it, commander views it as a loss when they leave. And I say, no, this is an opportunity. I want you to try to keep them, sure. But some people have just made a decision that they want some other things in life, some other challenges, but they can still serve, and they can still, it's not a total loss to the Marine Corps. They're available when the nation needs them for an emergency, if we can help support them by a reserve center, which sometimes it's a young Marine getting out. They don't necessarily want to go back to where they were before. If I can convince them, because I have a type of unit in a certain area, and let me help you get a job, and that would be partnering with you all, that somebody can walk in and go, yes, I've got a job here. I got somebody help me look for housing, and my family's going to be comfortable here, and I'm going to be able to drill at this center. And that's going to work for both of us. And I'm looking for quality people that are getting out the same way you're looking for quality people. So I think it can be very mutually supportive.
Yeah. Force Master Chief, I'm curious, as you kind of heard what our 2 panelists said here, as you go up and down the ranks and you're looking those young sailors, those Marines, soldiers, and airmen, Coast Guardsmen in the face, are you hearing these same kind of sentiments that the panelists are expressing?
Well, thank you, sir. We are same challenges, the retention, but talking to our sailors, they want that skill to join the Navy or join the service to serve, and when they make that transition out, they want a job. The skill set that they bring is not only counting the leadership, the maturity. Is spot on in 9 times out of 10. We don't say, we stop saying getting out of the Navy. We say transition. Yeah. Once a sailor, always a sailor. But with our civilian partners, communicating with them as much as we can, recognizing the outstanding employers out there that's giving our sailors or our servicemen and women opportunity. But going down the ranks, very similar to what we just shared. So thank you.
Good. It's clear that industry has a role to play in this, and I think our panelists are expressing that, and I think we're all in violent agreement. I am curious how you guys took the Marines. Once a sailor, always a sailor. They're probably gonna. You guys gonna arm wrestle for that one.
Hey, if you ain't cheating, you ain't winning. So.
But I want to shift it a little bit. But just take a little bit of what you all just said, and this is going to be to Lieutenant General Jensen and Healy and Vice Admiral. And I guess my question is, what can industry do? How can industry partner with you all on this? I mean, I think there's a lot of concerns that we're competing, as was expressed, we're not competing. There is a mutual benefit in this relationship. We just have to find it. But I guess my next question is, how is the Guard and Reserve component, can we work effectively with the companies on whether it's policies as I watch some of our Guard and Reserve members go off to do their duty, there's challenges on pay differential, a lot of different areas where we can maybe, help each other. So I'd be curious, are there some, areas in the policies or in, those transitions as they, go on and off? I'd love to hear, are there some partnerships that are working today? And are there some things that we can do to tweak some of those partnerships?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here today. And I really thank everybody that's here in this room really supporting our reserve component service members, because without you, we can't have the incredible reserve component that the United States military has. So there's a couple things. I'll give you two real quick, and then I'll talk maybe about a program real quick. First of all, what I would encourage everybody to do, if you haven't done so yet, is become very familiar with the ESGR, the Employer Support of the Guard and Reserve. Just a critical resource that is across our states. Many times we look at the ESGR and we say, oh, we only use that when there's conflict between service member and employer. Yes, they can do that, but what they really do is connect people, connect our service members, and educate employers, which I think is very important. Item number two, this would be a cultural thing. I would ask inside your organization just to take a look at what are your subtle discriminators inside of your company. When you're doing talent management, when you're making decisions on people moving up through your organization, do you have conversations like this? Well, the reserve component service might, gosh, they're gone for 2 weeks here. They might deploy. What I would ask you to do is not allow that subtle discrimination that can sometimes exist inside of an organization. What I'd like to give you is an example that I'm very familiar with because it was an effort that we started in Minnesota before I became the director of the Army Guard. I was fortunate to serve as the Adjutant General of the Minnesota National Guard. In the early 2000s, when the Army was deploying tens of thousands of Army reservists and Army National Guardsmen in and out of theater, we really had this approach that when we brought you back from theater, what we wanted to do was get you back home as soon as possible. So you could get back with your family, get back with your employer. What we learned after a couple of years of that was not really the approach to take. We needed to slow things down and help transition soldiers back into their homes and back into their employers. And that became known as the Yellow Ribbon effort. Well, out of that effort in Minnesota, we created what we called Beyond the Yellow Ribbon Company program. And the sole purpose of this effort was really kind of along, I think they're either called employee resource groups or infinity groups, but was to create a community inside of our businesses to help connect our service members, our veterans, and our family members inside of organizations, and then connect the organizations inside of those communities as well. And so we hired someone to come in and lead our effort here. And unlike other efforts, you can't just volunteer to come in. There's actually an application process and an assessment process to ensure that your policies, for example, are veteran-friendly, are service member-friendly, are spouse-friendly for service members, for example. And that you have an approach and a culture that supports reserve component service and honoring our veterans. And this thing, quite frankly, has took off and is as diverse as Target Corporation became a Beyond the Yellow Ribbon company, the Minnesota Vikings, the Twins, the Wild, St. Cloud State University. So across the full gamut of potential employers inside of the state of Minnesota, we were creating these really strong centers of service member, spouse, and veteran support. But what we found out was that also enabled companies to help bridge maybe employment gaps. I think that's an item we're going to talk about later today. because they had a go-to body inside of their own organization where they could say, how do I better connect with veterans and attract veterans to the company? And so they've got a great website. If you're interested in that, just Google Beyond the Yellow Ribbon, Minnesota National Guard. It'll bring you right up. We have an upcoming conference, I think second week in April. They'll bring all the Beyond the Yellow Ribbon companies together there in Minnesota. And I think it's just a great example of how we can partner. So thank you.
So I like that. And part of what I heard was sometimes these things are local. They start off in a local space and then they become more national. General Healy, any examples in your space where you think there's been some great partnership?
Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to get out of the Pentagon yet again. So we appreciate that. Although, like I always say, every time I get out of the Pentagon, it usually comes at the expense of a panel or a speech. So some examples. You know, I'll take myself. I think it's a relatively successful collaboration between the airline industry. I'm a captain in a major airline, and I think I've had a relatively successful career as well in the Air Force Reserve and the Air Force. So my apologies for, you know, I go with what I know in the airline industry and the rated officers program. I think that there's good collaboration. I think there's a lot more that can be done. With regard to policy, for instance, we actually had, last week I sat in a meeting between the Guard, the Reserve, the active component, and Airlines for America. And I saw there was an Airline for America representative on the panels or in the audience here today. What we're trying to do is figure out how those policies can be better tailored. The ESGR was mentioned, a wonderful, wonderful program with regard to protections for the individual servicemen as they go out and work in the community. And protections, for instance, if when mobilized, if when doing reserve guard duty, they aren't necessarily treated as fairly as they think they could have been. It's a legal backstop and understanding of what are the rules, what has been agreed to in most cases. But I think, you know, I'll be a little bit of an agitator here. I think quite honestly, I think the industry deserves the same protections with regard to hiring reserve and guardsmen as we do. We were talking on the walk up about how we're not competing for talent. And I'd argue that in some cases we are competing for talent. I know I'm competing every day with the active component for talent that comes to the reserve. The fleet chief mentioned the fact that it's not you're done at the end of your active duty service commitment, it's a continuum. Well, there's a challenge. You know, I need those people, and the active duty has the same recruiting retention requirements that I do, which is they want to maintain their numbers. Well, everybody they maintain is somebody less. I have 1 or 2 or 100 or 1,000 people less that I have access to try to bring into my career, into my structure. And the subtleness of it is, you know, we missed by 3.2% last year, and we didn't see a decrease in readiness. What we'll see in 2 years from now when we get a decrease in funding from Congress because we didn't meet our end strength. So that will perpetuate itself over time and eventually hit our ability to get after readiness in the future. So what can we do with regard to policy? I think, like I said, it's a degree of an accountability. It's a degree of if you're taking on, if you're being noble in terms of I want to make sure that I have quality leaders, quality people with experience that come work for you and within your organizations, I think you are owed just as much as the individual to ensure that you are not left hanging if they mobilize or if they use the reserve or the guard to their benefit and your detriment based on stability and predictability. Because to be honest, the culture of the reserve that I perpetuate in the Air Force Reserve is all about providing the family member, providing the member stability and predictability in their schedule and their lives so that they can pursue a military career, so they can pursue a civilian career. And I think it should be provided at no less to the companies that hire them on the outside, a degree of predictability of you know what those requirements are for that member when you hire them. You have a degree of stability in terms of understanding when you're going to need more help and when you won't. So I think it's a quid pro quo that I don't know if it's an agitator perspective on my behalf, but it's something that I see. I struggle with Airlines for America when we met. What can compel me to what can compel these airlines to hire reservists and guardsmen, knowing that they might, as soon as they're hired and go through initial training and get that sacred line number, drop 365 days of orders on them and not come to work for the next year, 2 or 3 years. It takes a lot on behalf of the industry partner to put that faith and trust in the system and hope that it's carried out with integrity on behalf of the member.
And I think a lot of my colleagues out here, we do have these conversations at our tables about how do we work through that. But Rhea Lafferty, I want to, as one of maybe the smaller services, is it the same? Do you have some of those same partnerships in the Coast Guard, or how are they different, and how are you forging those relationships?
Sure. So I think that there are a couple of things. One, we are the smallest service. So when I say how many positions, we have 7,000 positions. Of those, about a little over 6,000 are filled right now. So clearly we have a gap in our, in our numbers and in our recruiting. We have not met mission in the last couple of years on the active duty or on the reserve side. So that's something that we are continuing to get after and working through kind of a recruiting mindset of how do we improve that. What we're finding, though, is we do use our personnel a lot differently than the other services, than our sister services here. Our personnel, we are a little different. We don't have just a reserve unit, so we don't have a place that they go and everybody there is part-time. So our folks are integrated in with our full-time workforce. They are going to a unit that it may be 5 or 6 of them, it may be 20 of them. It's certainly not 2,000 like an air wing or something to that effect. We just don't have those kind of numbers. And so every single weekend when our reservists go and they show up, they're actually doing a job. They're not just training. They are literally getting out on that boat and they are doing inspections on fishing vessels, or they are connecting and interacting with the public, or they are going on a merchant mariner and checking for, making sure their equipment is there. They're responding to pollution. And we do this intentionally because on the Coast Guard side of things, we don't necessarily, not all the time, but in general, it's not this, hey, you're going to be deployed for an entire year. We respond to a lot more crises and emergencies. So as you think through the past year, we had Hurricane Ida down in Florida. So we had folks that responded to that. Right now we have Cubans and Haitians that are coming out of their country and seeking refuge in the U.S., and so we're doing interdiction there, and we have a whole support team that is down there. We supported the Afghan evacuation, and we had folks that were doing incident management and structures. And so we bring just kind of a whole different skill set there, and we utilize that on a frequent basis, and then on the weekends, but then also on those crisis and emergency response pieces. And so I think our personnel are utilized a little differently that way. And so you asked about that relationship. Certainly we have that relationship with employers, and we're not always able to give that predictability. But quite frankly, a lot of times our reservists can say, hey, I'm getting mobilized, but turn on CNN or Fox News or whatever your channel is in your office, and that's where I'm going. So they can kind of point to that. I've had to do that several times. And so I think the best thing that you guys can do is, one, support our folks, continue to hire them, look for those opportunities, especially on the Coast Guard side. There's lots of linkages. I mean, between the law enforcement, the emergency management, we have aviators, we have folks that work in the marine transportation industry, and there's a lot of interaction that we can find there. Our reserve personnel gain incredible skills during that drill time that they bring back with them. And one of the things that we are looking, you asked about a program, but one of the things that we are really intentionally trying to do is capture the skills that they're learning on the military side and do something kind of almost like a reverse credentialing, as opposed to them bringing their skill sets from their civilian career into the Coast Guard. What are we training them and equipping them? And we're trying to align that with civilian credentials to make sure, so if we're going to train somebody in emergency management and there are only 2 more things that if we would train them in that, they would have their emergency management certification on the outside. Or things like when we're talking about developing the cybersecurity rating right now that we're doing, how do we make sure that what we teach them and train them aligns with what may also be useful on the civilian side, so that we can have this joint partnership. So that's absolutely one of the things that we've been working on. And then you mentioned the predictability. Things like making sure whenever we can to do orders and give people information ahead of time that they're going to be deployed, or if we know that we're going to send them to a school or things like that, to give them that predictability, and encouraging our folks to make sure that they're telling their employers about that well ahead of time so that employers can do it. I am personally a small business owner. We have our own construction company of about 10, 12 people, so I know the impact that having one or two people missing, even when it's a sick day or they're taking vacation during the summer, it has a huge impact on what our projects are. And so fully value that and trying to make sure that our personnel are communicating that to our employers.
You said something in there when you talked about those kind of dual careers that are actually kind of going up parallel with each other. And so, General Healy, I'm going to come to you on this one, then I'm going to go back down the panel a little bit. Are there some things that you're seeing that we can do better as companies in this concept of dual careers and talent sharing? I can think about when I was, my first deployment to Iraq and having a battalion over in Iraq and getting my Guard and Reserve members over there, and the skills that they brought that were outside of their MOS, but what they were able to bring, we could do way more than just our unit capabilities were, simply because we had individuals who had a dual kind of capability that we didn't even anticipate. And as early days of Iraq, you needed every kind of skill out there to be able to get your mission. Are there some things that industry could learn or should be thinking about in this concept of dual careers, not competing? And and how should we think about that talent inside industries that you all provide us?
Well, I think from an industry perspective, I think it would be just about the encouragement of it. The challenge that we have is, well, first of all, from a military perspective, in the Air Force, we're looking at a concept called multi-capable airmen. So we're trying to define how we can leverage the talents of the civilian portion, the civilian experience in our workforce, into their reserve duty. And those can be very subtle things. Where, the way we look at incorporating this is, if conflict were to emerge with the PRC and we were to have to do a hub and spoke system out in the Pacific, we can't afford to build it up with security forces, with fuelers, with maintainers. They need to be multi-capable. We need a maintainer to have a weapon and defend the airplane. So those type things. So how do we, the challenge we have is, how do we capture that? Because historically there's been resistance with regard to what do I do and what are my skills in addition to what my service specialty is. For the longest time, I remember I spoke a little Spanish, and they said, hey, you should take a Spanish test. And I was like, why would I want to do that? I'll get deployed to Guatemala for 6 months, So it was one of those things where there's always been a little bit of reticence in terms of doing that. So that's what I would say. It would be encouragement. Is there a means by which industry can take advantage of your skill set that you might provide from the reserve? I use one of the great examples where we're trying to do this on a very low scale. Very high demand, low density type positions. I keep using this one particular instance. I had a senior airman, Urze. He was a 2T2, and if you don't know what a 2T2 is, it works at an aerial port. So they load cargo on airplanes and off. It's the most versatile position in the Air Force. 2T2s can do anything. They load stuff on and off the airplane. Senior airman. He held 2 PhDs in hyperglide vehicle assembly and dynamics. So he's now Lieutenant Urze, so okay, you are a deserving airman. I think we should promote you. But he's part of a program that we started called the Bullpen. It's literally 13 people right now. They know who they are, and from their civilian experience and their civilian expertise, this cargo manager along with an acquisition specialist who's a 1-star, and the diversity between the two of the 13 that look around the country in the defense industry in terms of where are there issues and needs with regard to hypersonic development at this time, and they go plug themselves in. And we're happy to provide the funding to go do that. Likewise, we're doing that for China too, for Chinese experts. So I think industry, if they're able to look and say, hey, what can I garner from your experience? I think that's one portion that they could do. And I again, encourage that they bring forth the expertise and the certification that they provide in their civilian sector, and see if we can leverage that in the military sector.
General Jensen, any thoughts on that? And as I kind of was listening and I think about this, I wonder how many employers actually ask, so what do you do in your vacation, is the way I hear them sometimes describe it.
Time off.
Yeah, that's the hardest question to ever answer. So what do you do, in the Guard? And you try to explain it, and in many cases it's unexplainable. So I think there's great cases of where our civilian experience really enhances your military experience. The example I use is the infantry battalion from the Army National Guard shows up in Iraq that's full of plumbers and electricians and a city manager. They bring all these civilian acquired skills to a very complex environment and are able to work their way through it because it's what they do back home. I'm reminded, in cyber, all of our great cyber warriors that have these great civilian acquired skills that through their reserve component service get to go do maybe something just a little bit different in that industry that fulfills maybe what they want to do professionally. And then a couple of different examples here where somebody's doing something completely different. On Friday, I was at the former Fort Pickett, Virginia, now Fort Barfoot. We just renamed Fort Pickett to Fort Barfoot after a great Virginian who had earned the Medal of Honor during World War II. But while I was there, I was talking to this UH-60 pilot, and she was explaining to me how she's a nurse on the civilian side, but didn't want to do nursing in the military. She wanted to fly helicopters, and I thought, wow, what a great life you have. And I think this is what is really important, is that to be able to sit down with your reserve component service member and have that discussion and see, where are things. People ask me about playing golf, and I always said, as a guardsman, I never picked up golf because I always worked the weekends. And, when you work in the week, I kind of felt like if I did have a free weekend, I was cheating on my family if I was playing golf. And so in many cases, it replaces a hobby for people. It fulfills a different part of their life. And I think that's really important. And don't be afraid of that employee who what they're doing is completely different than what they do for you. Because what I always like to say about our guardsmen is there's no such thing as a part-time guardsman. And I really don't like that term, because we expect them to be drug-free every day. We expect them to be fit every single day. We expect them to live the values of the Army values every single day. And that whether or not you're on duty or not, misconduct will impact your career. So we don't have part-time guardsmen. What we have are soldiers who primarily serve in a civilian capacity, but when called upon by their Army and their nation are able to fulfill that role too.
So, Rear Admiral Lafferty, I think General Healy kind of alluded to this. I've asked the question from the perspective, how can industry benefit from the talent? Is the reverse true? I mean, we talked about this young, individual who we convinced to go become an officer. Not that that's the, mark of, success, but it was an opportunity. Are you seeing the same thing in the Coast Guard, where you're looking at the talent that they have in industry and you're leveraging that in your formations?
We do that every day, every day. And I will say, we've talked law enforcement piece, we've talked emergency management. I'll give a story. So as Hurricane Ida was bearing down on Florida and was approaching, and they couldn't figure out which way it was going to go. One of the things we were continuing doing is we work with a lot of interagency organizations, especially down in Key West, one of them being Customs Border and Protection, CBP. Well, they have these essentially blimps that have radars, and they can detect when there's ships that are coming to either bring in migrants or drugs or whatever else is coming illegally into the U.S. And so they help us, and we interact with them all the time. Well, all of a sudden the track kind of shifts for Hurricane Ida, the winds start whipping up, and they start realizing, we got to get this thing down. And they had 2 of them up, and they also realized they only had 5 people there. So the CBP supervisor there called over to the Coast Guard and said, hey, can you send somebody, just somebody to help us get these, aerostats down? And so the sector commander there kind of pulled his reservists. You know who we had that was deployed down in Key West helping? One of a pilot of the Goodyear blimp. So the guy looked at me and goes, really? That's all I have to do? And so he goes over, because he does this like all the time. That's his regular job, is get the blimp up and get the blimp down. So he literally went over to CBP, he grabbed like 5 guys, he orchestrated the whole thing, and he got the 2 aerostats down, packed up and everything in like record time for CBP, and they were absolutely incredible. And we see that day after day after day. We did, and I use these as examples of contingencies, but we did some of the mass vaccination centers, and I know we had a lot of folks join, but we also had a small contingency of Coast Guard personnel that were helping kind of oversee how do we do this. They were having a hard time with how long it took one of the cars to go through the vaccination centers at one of these major stadiums. And so somebody said, I own a couple of Chick-fil-A's, and they're really good at managing traffic. So he quickly looked around, and he did a couple of analysis, and he said, hey, we're going to do it this way. And within 2 days, they were half the time going through. And I will say that's not unique, because I heard the same thing across all the services doing those kind of things, where we're able to use unique skill sets. We can't always mobilize folks if they have not self-declared that those are skill sets, but there are opportunities when they say, hey, I have this skill set and I think I can bring it to bear. And we use that on a regular basis as we do volunteer opportunities.
So they gave me an extra 15 minutes, so I'm going to call on a little bit of an audible here and maybe extend that question a little bit. And General Daniels, I want to come to you on this. We talked about industry looking for those skills that service member brings, but one of the things that we struggle with in companies is how to have that conversation. How do you start that conversation? How do you not ask or say the wrong things as part of that conversation? So I'm going to come to you on that and see if you've got any thoughts on that. And then, Force Master Chief, I'm going to come to you, and then Mr. Healy, or Hable, next, on you on that. So I'm calling an audible a little bit.
So I think it's all about transparency and sort of being open, upfront, and honest about what you're doing, what you're not doing, when you're going to be called away, when you're not, those kinds of things. So one of the challenges the Army Reserve had was back in 2019, there was a AAA audit done and said, how many days prior to a deployment are the soldiers receiving their orders in hand? It's supposed to be 180 days. Yep. What percentage do you think we were actually meeting that? 1. We were at a solid 1. I'm proud to say we're now at about 85%, because we get a bunch of emergent missions, and there's just no way we received the mission within 180, so of course we can't make those. But I have been obsessive about this every Thursday morning with my team. I'm like, okay, why don't those people have orders yet? And, lots of big open eyes as I'm drilling down. I'm like, okay, the family needs it, the employer needs it. You may be renting a place, you've got a mortgage, you've got a car that needs to go into storage, household goods, whatever. So this is important for the community that this, supporting this individual wherever it is they live, to make sure they have these orders. So I have been pushing very, very hard. Like I said, we're up to about 85% now, so that communications can take place. The employer can figure out how to backfill that person when they're going to be away. Now, we're not quite as good for the 2-week orders for going off to school or their annual training. But I'm pushing our team to get to 90 days for those, and then out to 120. But we're not quite there yet. But we're making some good progress on that front.
Enforcement Chief, any thoughts?
Very similar. But we actually, for the last 22 years, we have been definitely answering the call with that urgent, that instantaneously, let's get up and put your boots on, let's roll. So we're shifting more into that strategic competition, and we use our guiding light, our Navy Reserve fighting instruction, try to have more ability-based activation, meaning more predictability for the sailors, which in turn help out the employees, not to have that last-minute shake. It happens, got it. We're doing a great job, doing a better job to ensure that we give that notice. So it's difficult. We got it. We got some real world stuff that happens, and we need to answer that call. So.
Yeah, one of the questions I was curious from you on is flipping it back into the services. Do we need to have a conversation with our leaders all the way up the chain around how to talk to their service members about how to share with their employers what they do, the role that they have, that open communications? I get calls all the time from somebody going on duty or coming off duty that got extended and they didn't see it coming. If you're a large company, you can absorb that. If you're not a large company, that's a little bit more of a challenge. So how do we talk with our leaders up and down the chain to help their teammates understand this is a two-way dialogue?
Exactly. Probably the big word was transparency. And, very similar to the same conversation you said, General, about letting them know that, hey, yes, you have a job in the civilian world, yes, but you do have a commitment here. The same kind of, the policies, the same kind of rules for our employees should be the same thing for what we have for our sailors or for our guardmen. So having that conversation up front, to that upper leadership in that whether in industry as well as the leaders in the military, up front and be transparent as you possibly can.
So could I jump on this?
Yes.
So within the service, we take a very conscious look if a set of orders are going to be extended or curtailed. Because sometimes coming off an order early can be worse to the employer because you weren't expecting them back and they had budgeted and planned as well. So we take a very conscious effort to look at that timing, and we do a case-by-case analysis on every soldier as they're going through that demo process and when they do it. And if they're called to a mission and then suddenly they're not needed, well, then we may not send them back home immediately. We may, depending on their financial circumstances, they've rented their house, all kinds of things. The employer's found somebody else. It's going to be too hard to actually go back to work or go back to school. So we can keep a certain percentage on and serving for a significant time frame before they go back on their normally slated window. So it's a very conscious decision on each person.
I was going to add one other thing, too, that I think is important is, depending upon your industry, there may be times where the loss of that member, especially when we talk about emergencies or critical infrastructure, things like that, where that loss may have an opportunity. I know when we do some significant mobilizations on the Coast Guard side, we always look at that. When we did Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, when we did Katrina, we were looking also about what industry. I know when we were doing some of the hospital support and augmentation during COVID on the Joint Staff side, on the DoD side, one of the things that was looked at was, are these nurses or ICUs or doctors that are already engaged in their community? There were doctors or nurses that were in a community that did not have high COVID rates, and so they could get peeled out and so that they could be applied to other hospitals. We do the same thing. We would not pull out the emergency manager for the city of Miami when the hurricane's bearing down on them. And we have those folks in our thing. So I also think it's incumbent if you sit there and go, hey, we are experiencing a crisis within our own business, there are waiver opportunities, at least on the Coast Guard side, I don't know about the other services, but that we can say you are an emergency responder, our police, our fire, our medical, our EMTs, that we can absolutely have those kind of waivers processed. And that's a conversation that then the employer can also benefit from.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Hample, you've heard a lot of your colleagues and what they've set up here. Are there some things unique to the Marine Corps that you would say?
I would. The communication piece. So transparency, yes, but communication, and it's both ways. So General Healy's example about and as a infantry guy, I hate giving credit to aviators for anything, but but the aviation community, when and I remember getting a letter from Delta, like, hey, we put out a flight schedule on this date every month. So if you need one of our people, if you can let us know that before that date, every month, it's consistent, right? So, okay, and I quickly understood within the 1 month period, now it's problematic, very problematic. So okay, we can make that adjustment. That's not hard. I think what we're going to have to really talk about, both sides, this issue of permeability. The Marine Corps is like, hey, we're going to let people take a couple years off, and potentially I'm going to spend some years raising a child, whether male or female. We're going to allow somebody to do this, and then they're going to come back in. And same with you all. If you're going to let us use somebody for 2 or 3 years, what we've sat there and figured out is, okay, they can't miss this particular part of their career. They've got to. If you're an infantry person, you have got to be a company commander. That is kind of so we're going to make sure that that's not the period that you're looking to do a couple years out. I would say the same thing on the industry side. If you say, okay, this is an aggressive person. This is a lot of the capability, the leadership, the things that we, the military, provide you in terms of your employees. But you go, I've got to have them for this time. They can't miss this part of their civilian development. We've got a process. Then it's kind of a letter that comes in and says, I can't afford to lose this person during this 2 years, but he finishes this part on this date. You can use him or her after that. Then we can work together. So don't be afraid of the communication piece. It's really just sending a letter to a commanding officer or even to the service headquarters, where we'll then look in, and I think that really is beneficial to both sides.
I love that, and I think any of the folks who've been in sessions with me before know I talk a lot about we've got to get out of our current mindset about what works and be very, very creative. So I'm going to close this out in maybe a little bit of a different way. And what I'd like is maybe, we've got about 10 minutes, so maybe 2 minutes each. Any closing thoughts on what you want industry to know? That you've just been itching to say this to industry. We're in the room here. And Force Master Chief Hunt, I'm going to start with you. This is non-attribution room here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, where's that? Somebody here got to know. No, I think we said it. What we want is that support for our sailors and then also for our guardsmen and Coast Guardmen and airmen. That's what we want y'all to know. If you give that support across the board, no matter if they are your lowest paid employee to your CEO, we do have them in all these services. Mm-hmm. So no matter what their pay grade is in the Navy or what they're getting in the civilian sector, treat them with that dignity and respect. And understanding that, they chose to serve. We are not going to be able to, all us here on this panel is called strategic depth. We're the bench. If the Navy or active duty need it, we're going to be there. In some cases, we are the front. So providing that support, not giving that friction to our men and women, I think that's definitely have our readiness where we need to be at, as well as taking care of the family and that sailor.
Thank you, Force Chief. Admiral?
I think sum it up in 2 words, thank you. Thank you for for your service to our service members. Thank you for what you do to support them as they do their training, as they do their deployments, as they do their mobilizations. And I would tell you to be inquisitive. I mean, we've kind of mentioned it, but ask them what they're doing on the weekend. Because I think when you hear some of the stories or some of the cool things that they've been able to be part of, you're going to feel good that you're part of that, because you guys truly are. So you are making an impact on the national security, and making an impact on, when we have disasters here in the U.S., and on your fellow citizens, because that's who we are serving. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think sometimes we don't understand the uniqueness of the reserve component model in the Department of Defense of the United States of America. There is no other country that has the capability that we all represent. No other country in the world. For example, the Army National Guard, if I was a standalone army in NATO, I'd be the third largest army in NATO. And in a nation that has global responsibilities, we can only achieve those and meet those through our reserve component, augmentation support, and in many times leading our active component service. So what we have here is exceptionally unique, that we can't take for granted, because those things that we enjoy every single day are assured by several different things in our country, but one of them is our military. And our military can't achieve what we ask them to do on a day-to-day basis without the reserve component. And we can't exist without your continued support of our service members. So thank you.
So again, thank you. But of course, I've got to have an ask. So I'm going to go a completely different direction, because you can't get away without having an ask. And we talked about support and how you all support your service members. But I would ask you all to take a look around the rest of your folks who aren't serving and say, who might benefit from actually joining a service? Who might gain a little bit of maturity, some leadership skills? We do a lot of teamwork activities. Who could benefit from being in that kind of an environment? Even if it's just, doing the weekend periodically and a couple of, some weeks during the year. Who might find that as a great experience, help them build some camaraderie with some other folks, make some friends in different areas. They are fit, as mentioned, some of the different things that you'll find on these folks. So who else in your organizations could potentially benefit, or your other people that you know? The other is a little bit different, which is many of you are probably affiliated with some sort of professional organization, some sort of credentialing body in your profession. I would ask you to take a look at those credentials and see if they are transportable across states for the individual and their spouse. Because our reserve members also move between states besides the active duty component folks. And so the least amount of credentialing that they have to do to recertify as they go from point A to point B, so they can be back in the job market quickly rather than going through training again, would be advantageous. So, those of you who are in a position to influence those credentialing decisions across professional fields, I would ask for your support in making it as easy as possible to go between states. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'd chime in on a few things. The thank you, obviously, for not only hiring, but also for the interest in coming out to this today and the questions I'm sure in the discussion we'll have following. But I'd certainly jump onto the fact that the spouse is a critical part of this as well. My wife's perspective for decades has been, she's like, oh, what a shame you have to go fly on a trip for 10 days with your friends. And then when I get home, I do an airline job, and she's like, oh, what a shame you have to go to Aruba for the weekend. So there's the spouse not only at home, but there's the spouse. My wife's professional, and it's been very fortunate for us that as I've moved, we were homesteading for quite a while in one spot, and I was traveling to whether it was St. Louis or whether it was Massachusetts or whether it was here to DC. But then we made ourselves mobile again. And I can't say enough about her employer and their ability to not only open up their mind with regard to, hey, can this individual telework for me, before telework was truly a thing with COVID, but continue to be a productive member of their organization. And quite honestly changed the way, she works for a major university, changed the way they approach how they look at work. So I'd ask you to take that in mind too, in consideration. Is there an ability to keep an employee, especially if they're a spouse, if their serving member moves away? Lastly, I'd say you deserve no less, you all in the industry deserve no less than I expect from every one of my 70,000 plus reservists, which is integrity in terms of how they serve and accountability in terms of how they serve as well. I think you deserve no less than that.
Thank you.
I think the thank you is universal, but like General Daniels, I'm going to throw an ask with that. The spousal part I was going to mention is for our active duty forces, when a service person deploys, there is a big support group right there to help with the spouse, the children. That's not true for our reservists for the most part. And that can be you. A lot of your organizations, and I'll hear this from service managers, say, yeah, my wife or my husband's really looking forward to me getting back so they can, because they enjoyed this company picnic and they didn't get to go this year. I'm like, why? Well, because I was deployed. So the families are still there. If you can still treat them as part of your company, maybe help out getting the kids to some ball games, things like that, that makes a big difference for our reservists that are obviously worried about their families while they're deployed. You can help remove some of that concern, and that would be greatly appreciated.
So I love how the last panelist brought in the spouse. We were having a conversation upstairs talking about really what I argue is the key to this, and that's the spouse, and for those who are married, because they are a critical component of the readiness of any organization. And so thank you all for bringing that in. So now I think we're going to open it up for questions. Brad, how are we going to do this? We're going to just walk it around. So if you have a question, I got all of mine out. So if you have a question at the table, just raise your hand, and Brad will make sure you get a mic.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Hey, my name is Sean Conroy. I'm a solutions technologist at Microsoft, and full disclosure, I'm a Louisiana National Guardsman. A couple quick points. First of all, thank you so much. You've hit on so many incredibly important points. I did want to talk a little bit about the industry skills. One of the issues I had is that as a solutions technologist for Microsoft and a cop in the National Guard, I have to go back to school so that I get that MOS or AFSC qualifier, because there's no way for them to say, there's no way for the service to say, oh, you're really good at that, you can actually do that. So then I end up, it's a bit of a deterrent. I mean, I'm not really in a position where I can go back to school for 15 weeks at this point. So that it just, maybe there's some way that we can move industry knowledge across without killing the reservist at that point, or the active component person for that point, as you draw folks. The second thing is Mr. Habel's point. The need to take care of a child or another family member or a parent, that's not predictable. So what about a paradigm where we just reset the year? If a person's a 2010 year group and they have to take 2 years off for whatever reason, we're not judging the reason, maybe they reset to the 2012 year group. And that keeps them in line with a new set of peers, but peers nonetheless, and doesn't penalize them for missing some milestones in there. It just allows them to get into those milestones. And then finally, the credentialing. My wife's a physician. That's an amazing advantage to so many people as we moved across. And I remember every time we moved, she ran down to the state capitol. Even if we weren't living in the state capitol, she went to the state capitol and had to kind of half beg her way in, and then wait at least 30 days before getting credentialed. Thank you.
So I heard dual credentialing. I heard career alignment with year groups, kind of, and then credentialing for the spouse. So who wants to tackle that one?
I'll take the first one as it relates to your conversation about you have civilian acquired skills and we should be able to apply them to the military. And we're really trying to do that inside of the cyber community right now. Because, so the Army has recognized that they have the ability to take incredibly talented people from the civilian world that have immediate skills, even if they're not MOS qualified. But at the end of the day, the Army, we're an industrial-based organization. We still have industry standards, if you will, that we're very protective of. So what we're working with, Jody's team, our team, the Army, we're working on this idea of how do we identify those skills? Because the good thing about that industry, you come with certifications or certificates, right, that proves that you've gone through this. How can we apply that to the standard school that the Army has? So maybe instead of 36 weeks, maybe it's only 10 weeks. And then being able to align it, because you don't want to go for 2 weeks, leave for 8 weeks, come back for 2 weeks, leave for 4 weeks. So I will tell you, I think General McConville, as the Chief of Staff of the Army, has really been trying to push the Army towards this idea that we need to get into the information age and leave the industrial age behind. And how can we account for skills that already exist? Your wife is an example. If she was an Army Guardsman, we wouldn't make her go back to med school just because she joined the Army, right? They would say, hey, we accept this. Well, we got to take that a little bit lower inside of the organization, as it relates, I think, to technical specialties. If you're an infantryman or a field artilleryman, there's really no relatable skill, back. So I mean, you're just gonna have to do that.
We lob artillery every now and then.
Yeah, so it's called reciprocal credentialing.
Yeah.
Is the program. We've got a number of organizations inside the Army taking a look at a number of the different skill sets, firefighter, some of the medical ones, besides cyber, driver's licenses for various different engineering kinds of skills. So we actually have this long list of all the different skill sets and the different credentials, and how do we get credit? So the active component gets credit for some of them, but the reserve component does not. We're like, well, how does that make any sense? So we're going and fighting that battle. I literally looked at the list yesterday. So we're trying to get after that. But I'm going to skip over to your timeout question and the reset. So what's interesting is the Army has this group, it's called the Individual Ready Reserve. And it ends up with like 3 different pots of people in it. You go in there when you finished your enlistment, but you still have a little bit of time left, and you're waiting for your clock to click off as fast as it possibly can, because you don't really want to be serving anymore. Then there are those that go in there and they're looking for a next position, and they want to see what they're going to do next. So they go in there for a little bit of time, find another job, and they go back out and do that other position. And then there's a group that needs that time out, wants to take a break, wants to take a reset, family issue, maybe an aging parent, maybe they're just overwhelmed with school and small kids and whatever. And they really want their clock to stop and take a break. The problem is we have no means to differentiate amongst these 3 groups right now, between those who want it to go faster than yesterday and those that want it to just pause and those that are just sort of taking a look around. So we need to look at our systems of how do we help all 3 of those groups. And so that's something that we have not yet solved.
Ram, are you going to say something?
Yeah, so we do the same thing on the IR piece, but one of the things that we've actually just recently done is we call this thing, it's called an opt-out program. Mm-hmm. So, we talked about that dual career, and we talked about there's certain milestones that you may need to have on your civilian side and on your military side. And so sometimes what we found is, folks get kind of that middle manager, and they're reaching for senior manager, both on their military side and on their civilian side at the same time. And so somewhere, something just has to have a balance. Yep. And so what we have done is we've given folks kind of at that middle manager level, we call it the 04 level generally, and they can opt out of promotion. So they can say, hey, not this year. I do not want to take on going to that next level. I have not had an opportunity to do some of those milestones that we need to do. And this gives them an opportunity to say, hey, I still want to drill. I still want to be part. I don't want to decrease my responsibilities necessarily because I'm still enjoying that reserve piece. I just didn't know that I haven't met a milestone, or I'm not quite ready to step up to that next level. And they can do that. I think it's for 2 years right now. And it's really just at that kind of that middle manager. As As we get more senior, they're kind of like, hey, we're going to look at you and we'll decide or not, and then you stay in or not. But at that middle manager piece, that 04 level, we're absolutely doing that. And that gives a little bit of the balance between the civilian and the military career.
Thank you. Other questions?
Good afternoon. Josh Eccles, Raytheon Intelligence and Space. You look around this room, you have like the champions for SkillBridge. You got Candy Tillman, you got Builders First Source, who had over 400 SkillBridge candidates last year. We know that SkillBridge was authorized by law for the reserve components, but we also know it's not funded and it's not a practical functioning program yet. So what is being done to address that disparity between what the active duty service members get during their transition and those entry-level TPU or Army Reserve or service members that are joining the reserve components? What's being done at a policy and legislative arena to fix that?
We need ROA's advocacy to go over and get money off the Hill.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I would agree with that, right? The Coast Guard just started SkillBridge. Like, I think we're in year one of actually even looking at SkillBridge. But one thing that I have heard, and it's interesting because I'm going through the transition course today, and we had the SkillBridge briefing this morning. But one of the things we talked about was, right now our active duty forces are, they are running short, especially on the Coast Guard side. Right? We've got active duty gaps. We have reservists filling in those gaps. And so it's hard for those active duty commands to then look and say, hey, 12 weeks or 6 months of being gone in some of these transition programs. I think that's a little short-sighted, because what it does is it just prepares our service members for the next phase and gives them those opportunities for them to take the service that they had and those skills and bring them into the civilian career. But I do know that those are some of the things that we've been heard, but certainly the funding piece and all of that is incredible.
So I'm going to say this, and my team knows this, and all the folks that are around me know this. I think that's the solution to the future of the force, is SkillBridge. And I do think it's short-sighted that the services are doing some of the things, particularly the active component, some of the decisions that have been made of late. I question it because I think the services have an attraction problem. And you cannot make the service as attractive if you don't demonstrate that you're going to take care of them as they transition. And so I think we got to tweak that. So it is a policy thing. Most of us who are in the room, who are on the Hill advocating, we're talking about SkillBridge every chance we get. It's been opened up to the military spouse. Why can't we take it to the next level and then open it up to the Guard and Reserve? So you've got our vote on trying to find ways to do that. So,
and the talent we're attracting is looking for that.
Exactly.
Right? They're asking, how does this translate?
And then we'll come to you, sir, right behind him.
Hi, John Perez. I'm the head for Military and Veterans Affairs at Johnson & Johnson. I actually wanted to pick up on that last line of discussion a little bit and really ask a broader question on how are you changing some of the incentive structures for some of those mid-level leaders? A great thing in the military is that we decentralize decision-making. We bring it to the lowest level possible. How do you change incentive structures in your relative formations to best enable these public-private partnerships and support recruiting, retention, and long-term career success for your service members? Thanks.
Anyone want to take that one on?
We're all looking at each other.
Bueller?
I mean, the incentive structure is predominantly in the active component, which, we have special pay, we have special location, retention incentives, but nowhere near what the active component is pushing out in terms of incentives to stay. And as I mentioned early on, I think that is in direct contradiction with our ability to affiliate members from the active component. I was giving a data point earlier in the day that 2020, when COVID was at its peak, the Air Force active component put out a pay bonus for pilots to stay in while no one was getting out because there was so much uncertainty in the world. That effectively wiped out the entire 2010 graduating class of pilot training from ever serving in the Reserve or Guard, because they had such a high take rate. It's back to normalcy right now because the economy is good, places are hiring, but it's, we can't compete with some of the, two things. We can't compete with what the incentives are being offered to the active component to stay. I don't believe they should be using those. I think they should be looking at it from a continuum of service perspective, where they should be looking at, instead of a 10-year active duty service commitment, they should be looking at a 30-year career split between 8 to 12 years of active and then another 18 to 20 in the reserve component, looking at the return on investment from a holistic perspective, where we can then share that very talented individual with industry. That's an uphill challenge for me right now. So hopefully we'll be working down that path.
We're in a very unique position right now because we have transitioned.
That was non-attribution, right? Sorry.
We've transitioned from a retirement system where when you achieve 20 years of service, whether a reserve component or active component, you then became eligible for a pension, to this blended retirement program that's more akin to what we find in private industry. But we're very new into that transition. Our incentive program still is pretty much based on the old system, meaning this, that the key point was for an enlisted soldier, that 6-year mark. If I could incentivize you to continue your career past 6 years, and if I could theoretically get you to 10 years, then you will self-select in, because now you feel vested. Well, now you become vested significantly earlier in the program. I don't think we have enough data to really understand how that's going to change our incentive program, because it should. It should change. If years don't really matter, then our incentive program has got to change. So I think we're just a little bit too early in that program right now.
Sir.
Hi, Pat Span. I did 28 active reserves until they kicked me out, and then for the first time since 1 July '65, I didn't have to shave anymore. So anyway,
We're not doing beards in the Air Force.
I spent my last 2 years as active duty in the mid-'70s at Port Hueneme. So it's fun being an Army captain, and I was a CI guy in civilian clothes, because whenever I made reservations at the club, they thought I was an 06, which is because I'd introduced myself as Captain Span. So anyway, I did a lot of time traveling over as TDYs to embassies, and I used to talk to the Marines, and I was always amazed. I was explaining to them that the beauty of the reserves, at least I'm unfamiliar with the new system, I guess, that you, after 20 years, you lock in your percentage,
50%.
but the base they throw that against is the base when you turn 60. So you absorb all that, the COLA increases. I know in my case it was very significant. But I was always amazed that they never heard of that. And I always thought that would be, maybe it sounds to you guys too mercenary, but I would think that would be a bit of information to stress, especially when they started to do in 10 years or something like that, that you've locked in a percentage, but remember that your base pay is going to keep rising, and the base pay they use is the one that you would have earned at 60. And I know in my case, from 97 to 06, it got a double. My base almost doubled for in those years, and of course that doesn't say anything good about inflation. But I would think that type of, maybe it sounds too mercenary, but that should be stressed so that they understand that. Because I was always amazed that these MSGs at the embassies didn't have a clue what I was talking about.
So I think the question is, how do we continue to educate the force on the options, the opportunities they have to continue to serve in different capacities?
So in the Army, Jody and I both have, at active duty installations, we actually have senior NCOs that's their sole job. As soldiers are transitioning off of active duty, they come see our folks as part of their out processing to ensure that we are able to talk to them about things like that and their ability to continue to serve inside of the Army Reserve, inside of the Army National Guard. It is mercenary in the sense that, some people do strictly, serve for a goal of retirement. Some people serve for different reasons, but I think it's, to your point, is you want to lay down all of the facts. What we find is that family members are more interested in discussions like that than the service members sometimes, right? Because they've decided for whatever reason, I'm just getting out. But yet when you can talk to a spouse, for example, about the benefits of long-time service, that suddenly becomes, it appeals a little bit heavier.
We have the same career field managers, the same individuals at our units to do the same advising, career field advisors on whether or not, what's available to them based on their career, if they stay and so forth. I think what's lacking, and I get back to what I was talking about before, is the inclusion of more than a cursory overview of the reserve component during professional military education for our officer corps, so that as the individual is approaching the transition off their active duty service commitment, they get more than a checked box in a checklist that's 6 pages long that says that they've talked to their career advisor with regard to reserve component opportunities. So that whether they're in SOS for us, the basic education for the 03 level, ACSC, which is our 04, 05, or 05, 06, and senior, that they have a clear understanding of every aspect of what the reserve component offers, not only in terms of jobs and in terms of progression, but in terms of benefits as well. I think it's lost quite a bit from the senior leadership on down.
What we just started doing, our 4th Sergeant Major said, why are we relying on headquarters to pass information about the reserves? And it almost as oh yes, talk about the reserves also while you go out and do your manpower. And so we selected sergeants, staff sergeants, in some cases corporals that were superb performers. And we said, we're going to put you on orders. We're going to send you, you're going to get to go to Hawaii to talk to the Marines that are getting out there. And we found out that we almost tripled the number of active duty Marines that then did a direct affiliation with the unit, because they wanted to hear from people that were like them. I'm a sergeant, I'm getting out, and there's a sergeant that's in the reserves and enjoying the heck out of it, and he can answer my questions about how it really works. I'm always distrustful of higher headquarters. So that's what we're doing more of that. And then also in our professional education programs, my boss, Lieutenant General Bellin, has literally spoken to every, the basic school, which is where we put all of our brand new second lieutenants through that. He has spoken to every single class and said, this is what the reserves are about. Understand this now. Not because you're gonna have to make a decision 4 or 5 years from now. You are, but right now you're going to get out there in 4 months. You're going to have Marines getting out, and I want you to be able to tell them the truth about the reserves. So it's an investment that really seems to have paid off for us.
So the good news is you're going to get to continue these conversations at the round table. The bad news is we're at the conclusion of the panel. So I want to thank my panelists.
Thank you.
and tell you that just take this same energy and some of the questions that maybe you didn't ask, and maybe continue that conversation as we start the round table. So I think we're going to take a break here, Brad.
General Phillips, come up. And just do a thank you to our panelists.
Thank you, panelists. Just want to thank our panelists for being here today, and some of you I think are going to be staying a little bit longer to facilitate discussions, and that's quite a gesture on your part to do that. Mark, I want to present a coin to you in appreciation for a great job of moderating a great panel.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Greg, thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. You're off.
It's an honor.